Welcome to the MJSA podcast. My guest on this episode, if you followed MJSA for any amount of time, he barely needs an introduction. Joel McFadden is joining us. Joel, it's good to see you. Thanks for being with us. We're going to talk a little bit today about a topic that is in the MJSA Journal this month. That's the January 2022 issue of the journal that's out. So if you're listening to this at some other time, you can go back and follow up on these articles. But we'll have them posted in the show notes page as well. That's at podcasts.mjsa.org. So we're going to talk a little bit about gemstones and handling gemstones and how that's a little more complicated and stressful probably than some people realize. And Joel is featured in the article that we have in the current issue, and you have an At the Bench article as well on doing some colored gemstone setting in this issue as well. So anyway, jumping into it, let's talk a little bit about getting started with stone setting training, because that's probably the beginning of all of this, is understanding what you're doing in terms of setting stones and how to handle them and what to watch out for. So how do you sort of approach that, or what's your sort of where do we start in terms of talking about training and understanding, how to begin?
I think that is where the problems begin, and that's because 95% of the stone training is based on setting diamonds, and I understand why people do that, because that's what a jeweler is going to be setting 3/5 of the time. But you teach someone to set a diamond, which is usually ideally cut very, very hard, a very precise shape. The burrs are shaped the same way as the diamond and whatnot. You teach someone to set that, and they get comfortable with that. And then suddenly you hand them an emerald, which may have a completely different faceting structure, a really deep belly. It's maybe not perfectly round, it's not perfectly shaped, and it's very difficult for people to just make that sudden adjustment. I mean, it literally is put the square peg in the round hole. You taught people how to set under ideal and perfect conditions, and then suddenly one day you go to that jeweler and say, here, set this, how to, and the jeweler's like, actually I don't, because we don't train in that.
Right, and the idea that if you learn one particular stone or master setting one or two specific stones, that doesn't automatically mean that you then know how to set, like you said, anything that gets put in front of you. I mean, there are major differences, I assume, between setting different types of stones, diamonds, color, etc. So that has to be a big part of it. Yeah.
Well, for one thing, a lot of people talk about hammer and anvil setting a diamond, which is where you literally take the diamond and you take the prong and you hammer the prong down on top of the diamond, and you're using the diamond as an anvil to hammer that gold prong or that silver prong or that platinum prong onto. And you can do that with a diamond, because a diamond is a 10 hardness and isn't brittle. And sometimes you could damage a diamond, but it's rare. And so we teach people to do that. But if you do that same thing with, say, an opal, you're likely to break or damage the opal. So you can't. So you have to approach the entire process differently. Another aspect of the problem is, one of the most common repairs in the jewelry industry is prong tipping. So if you have a diamond ring and the prongs are worn out, you can literally solder a little bit of metal on top of it and you're good to go. You could do that with a ruby, as long as it's not a treated ruby, as long as it's a heated ruby. You can do that with a sapphire as long as it's been heat treated. Mm-hmm. But if the sapphire hasn't been heat treated, you could shear and crack the sapphire. And you can't do it with most other stones. But here's the thing. How do you know if it's been a heat treated sapphire or a treated ruby? You don't know. You're guessing.
Right.
And that's a lot of pressure to put on a bench jeweler.
So let's talk a little bit about, as we were getting into initially there, sort of the difference, though, between some of the differences, though, in general, between setting diamonds and setting colored stones. How do you think about that, or how do you approach that when you're trying to maybe give someone some pointers, or start to train somebody yourself? What do you look at as the key differences to kind of touch on there?
I think the first key is understanding that you cannot cut a seat for a diamond and necessarily force a colored stone in there. Yes, there are diamond cut sapphires and rubies, and in a rare case, you'll get a gemstone that's cut the same as a diamond, but that's very rare. Usually, they are one of the things when they cut colored stones is they usually leave we call it junk in the trunk or belly bottoms and stuff like that. And the bottom of the stone often looks like a gumball.
Hmm.
It's round and curved and thick and big, and they have wide girdles, and that is to create the color in the stone. So the deeper the stone, the more material you have in the bottom of the stone, the more it holds its color. So gemstone cutters cut for the optimum color, and they also cut to add weight. So a 5 millimeter stone, in a diamond is going to be about a half carat, but in a colored stone, it might be 3/4 of a carat. So the first thing I teach people is don't assume that you can go in there and take a 5 millimeter burr and cut a seat like you would a diamond and jam a colored stone in there. You're going to have to carve a seat out, usually with much smaller burrs that matches your stone exactly.
Hmm.
That's really the number one key is cut a seat that matches the stone precisely. And then it'll be a lot easier cutting the stone, setting the stone.
What about when we get into something that I think we touch on a little bit in the article in the sidebar about the fact that just handling different gemstones too must be something that people people come across in terms of I think we touched on it in the article, or you touched on it in the article, as really being sometimes just an issue of like cleanliness, making sure that you're not setting gemstones down in certain areas that could potentially damage them, even though you might not think that would be an issue. Can you talk a little bit about that, just as kind of, people think, yeah, my bench is clean enough. I'm not. It's not a huge disaster, so I'm fine. But there's a little more to it than that.
Right. Well, in the article I talked about, we had an issue where we were working with tanzanites a lot in the 80s. They were really hot. And we would, you take the stone and you put it in the seat, and you go, not quite, and you put the stone down and you carve the seat a little bit more. And then you pick the stone up and you go, there's a scratch on the table. How'd that happen?
Hmm.
And what we realized was that with some stones like tanzanite, that you have abrasives on your bench from grinding wheels or other pieces of metal or who knows what, just laying gently as dust on the wooden surface of your gemstone of your jeweler's bench. And if you slide the stone around there, you could in fact scratch it.
Right.
So now we're really, really careful to always put the gemstone, in a cotton thing or on a paper or something like that, where it can't slide around or get pushed around, or, you could do something as simple as set it down and actually push it up against the file by accident without even thinking about it. I'm going to set it on the side of my bench here, and there's a file there, and I actually pushed against the file. Sometimes with these softer stones, that's all it takes.
And another, I think another extension of that is too being a little more aware of how you're how you're handling the gemstones too, in terms of picking, what you're going to grab something with or pick something up with tools versus, I think in the article we make mention of the fact that sometimes you don't even want to be using some sort of tool. I think that's something I've heard you talk about before in presentations and stuff as well.
Well, that's getting into the hardnesses of the stone, and the hardness reflects the ability of the stone to be scratched, not broken, but scratched. And a lot of stones you have to look at. I think we put a Mohs scale in the article, and that to me was super enlightening because you know diamonds are harder than steel. So you can use tweezers on them. You can take a file and go around a diamond, and if you're careful, you'll be fine. But you cannot do that with most colored stones. I use brass tools a lot. So like I have a little pusher that if I have to push a stone into a setting, just give it a little push. I'll use a brass tool instead of a steel tool.
Hmm.
I might even use a chopstick because they're pretty dense. So I'll cut the end off a chopstick sometimes. And, because they're softer than the stone. So basically, you have to make sure that the tools that you're using are softer than the gemstone that you're handling. Stainless is an option. You can make tools out of stainless steel, which is a fork tine. You can make tools out of brass. You can make tools out of copper. You can make tools out of wood. I know jewelers that use hard ebony tools to burnish cabochons in, because the ebony is not going to scratch. But that's a really important thing to think about and consider. And they don't teach that in the schools much either. One of the stones that's very popular now is apatite. And apatite is one of those things that probably shouldn't be used in rings, because it is so fragile that, I mean, you can hit it, you can grab an apatite with a pair of tweezers and scratch it very easily. So it's almost like when you do an apatite, you have to use brass and wood only. Anything else is going to scratch it.
One of the things that you had laid out, it was something regarding shape hardness and fracturing of stones. Do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm. We get used to setting diamonds, and we think diamonds are the hardest thing in the world. And so when I was a little kid, like 8 or 9 years old, my grandfather told me that. I took a diamond and I set it on a steel block and I hit it with a hammer, and everything was fine. Nothing happened. It bounced. But then I did it again, and then it shattered. So, with a diamond, you usually can be pretty brutal with them. You can hit them, you can torch them, you can slip your tools and scratch them, and you can take a hammer to them, and they're usually okay. But with a gemstone, even if you are using tools that are the right material that won't scratch it, you can shear it or fracture it. A good example is, some jewelers call emeralds frozen gardens, because they have a lot of inclusions and a lot of openings, and a lot of these inclusions are shearing lines. And you could put just a little bit of pressure along a shearing line, and that emerald will break it too in a second. A lot of other stones have that. Jewelers need to really look deeply at the gemstone that they're working on and look for those shearing lines, especially the ones that come to the surface. And don't put prongs there, don't pressure there. Do not hammer and anvil. We talked about hammer and anviling earlier, where you're using the gemstone and forcing the prong onto the gemstone. Don't use the gemstone to shape the prong. Shape the prong by cutting your seats properly, and then line the prong up, either vector tightening or something like that, so you don't put that pressure. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is we can teach a person to set a diamond by cutting the hole and then putting the diamond in and then banging the prongs over. Right. And that's you see that a lot with claw prongs and lots of prongs, but that's one way of doing it that works with diamonds, and it works with sapphires and very little else. Everything else, you need to shape the prongs and then trap the stone in the prongs. So I like to shape the prongs or the bezel or whatever, and keep it far apart, drop the stone in, and then work the prongs in until it's trapped.
Is that an example of, you mentioned vector tightening? Is that really what vector tightening is? That sort of slow process of kind of squeezing things together more evenly like that around the stone?
Yeah. So vector tightening is it's something that Blaine Lewis described. He's the one who came up with the terminology vector tightening. And so if you have a stone and you have a prong, the traditional way of setting it is to just basically hammer that prong down over the stone. So, vector tightening is, if this is my prong, instead of forcing my prong to bend down here, I'm going to bend it back and forth this way, because it closes. Because especially with white gold, you have spring back. So if you push the prong to where you want it, it's always going to spring back 20 or 30%. So what you end up having to do is just hammer it down hard, so you actually push it past the point where you want it to be. And with a diamond, you can get away with that, but with a colored stone, that might crack the stone. It's right. Very likely to. So you have to learn to move the prongs back and forth and push them in a little bit at a time.
So it sounds to me like, as you said in the beginning, if you're a jeweler or an aspiring jeweler, and you're sort of coming coming into the industry or starting to learn more, it sounds like this is one of those cases where, I mean, it gets said a lot, but knowledge is really power here in terms of understanding that you as a jeweler who's going to start working with these things, the more you can sort of absorb information about, okay, where do these stones fall on the hardness scale, and what are their characteristics, and how careful do I have to be? I mean, but some of this also must be a little bit of making some mistakes, which I'm sure happens in terms of, as you're saying, the story you told about the diamond, sort of making these realizations. I mean, some of that I'm sure is going to happen where you're going to have some instances where something does go wrong, and you sort of you're going to learn from that. Can you think of any that stand out in your mind when you were starting out in terms of um, something that did go wrong, did break, that made you realize, oh, I need to work on this, or I need to understand this better?
Yeah, I set a really large pink tourmaline for somebody one time, and I was, good enough is, or where do you stop? I think a big mistake that a lot of jewelers make is they rush through the process of setting a stone, and then they decide that they're going to clean it up.
Hmm.
And this was a bezel set pink tourmaline, and I have learned what I learned from that was to clean up the top of my bezel before I set the stone. But at that point, I was still setting the stone and then taking a graver and running the graver around the edge of the top of the bezel to clean it up after I set the stone. And when I did that, I scratched the stone with the graver. Not bad. We were able to remove it and repolish it. It cost me $200 to repolish it, and then I had to redo the thing and set it back together. But it delayed the piece and the whole thing. And then after that, I thought, why on earth am I doing this? Why don't I take a file or the graver or flat lap and clean up the top of the bezel once I've got the stone seated properly and I know where everything's going to line up? Now I go take the stone out. I cut the seat for the stone. I know it's right. I take my gemstone out, especially a fragile colored stone. I polish everything then, everything to finished level. Then I set the stone, and then I just do the minimal polishing to clean up the area. Because a lot of times, I've even seen jewelers that work for me. They'll have a really nice. We had an emerald this happened to, not a big one, but guys finished ring, emerald ring. He's polishing, and it grabs it in the polish machine. It goes bang, 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 bounces against the steel. Sure enough, the emerald's chipped. So now I just say the last thing I want to do is set the gemstone and then clean up that setting, and then I'm done with it. And I think a lot of jewelers immediately go and set the stone. Sometimes I've seen them, they'll set the stone and then size the ring, you know. Yeah. So set the stone last. That's probably the biggest takeaway.
So, in terms of sort of maybe wrapping it up in terms of what we talked about at the very beginning, that's certainly a good piece of advice. What else would you say maybe, or what do you think can maybe be done overall in terms of if we want to improve obviously a little bit of the next generation of jewelers that are going to be coming up? What can they do to be more aware of these types of things? Is it just a case of taking more time, spending more time, trying to absorb as much knowledge and training as you can get?
My son's a jeweler. He's a very accomplished jeweler, and he calls me sometimes. Hey, Dad, I got to set this or I have to do that. How should I handle that? And we'll talk about it. And just that dialogue sometimes. It's not like I have all the answers, but a lot of times just having a dialogue with somebody else opens up an idea. I mean, a lot of the great ideas I've come up with is by talking to other bench jewelers. We get together and talk about what's driving us crazy, and maybe one guy has a solution, or maybe the two of you work out something. I think you need more of that. I think jewelers in the United States, frequently they come out of school and they go to work for a store and they're alone. And the salespeople in the store have no idea. They just want stuff done now, fast. Slow down, take your time. If you have a scary project, don't be afraid to get on one of the forums or contact the MJSA jeweler or somebody, or maybe talk to another jeweler in your area, or talk on the phone and, hey, I got to set this. What do I have to look out for setting this, stuff like that. So it's just communication.
It's big and important, and it does surprisingly get overlooked when everybody sort of feels very siloed and focused on whatever happens to be in front of them. But good advice and good material, and thanks again for taking the time to talk to us today, Joel. Appreciate it.
Well, it was good to see you again, and
Yeah.
I think we can't. We're all looking forward to COVID being over, and we're all getting together and being in person again.